Hello, and welcome to this episode of Someone You Know, a podcast about disabilities, those who have them, and those who love them. I'm your host, Andrew, and today I'm at the Center for Mad Culture in the Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago, where I'll be talking about the history and intricacies of mad culture, as well as discussing some of the programs and exhibitions that the Center for Mad Culture has to offer. With me today is the founder and director of the Center for Mad Culture, Mr. Matt Bodett. Matt is a mad artist, activist, and educator dedicated to exploring madness as a cultural identity. Using his experiences in art and activism to help others challenge dominant cultural narratives surrounding madness and to uplift voices in the mad community. Thank you for joining me today, Matt. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
If you haven't heard of mad culture or disability art and expression before, don't click away, because we'll be explaining all of that and more coming up. If you or someone you know has a disability or has experience with the disability community, then this podcast is for you. And even if you personally don't know anyone with disability or have no experience with disability in your life, I'm willing to bet that someone you know loves someone with a disability. By listening here today, you'll learn more about the larger community of people with disabilities and their ways of expressing themselves. Let's get started. So for those of you that have been listening to these last few episodes, you'll know that I am currently a senior undergraduate at UIC. I am finishing up my coursework. And as a disability and human development major, students are required to take a capstone course that pairs them up with an organization in Chicago so that students can get hands-on experience working with the community and learning about the different organizations that are available. Now, as part of my requirements, I was matched up with the Center for Mad Culture, where I met Matt over here. Now, this was a very different experience working with the disability community for me because most of my expertise is in special education with my experiences as a paraprofessional working with kids with autism. But working with madness and disability art was a big change of pace. It got me acquainted with new people and with different kinds of knowledge regarding disability, especially when it relates to the mind. And I also learned a little bit about how my education in disability studies can be applied to understanding madness and mad culture. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the guest that I have with me today is Mr. Matt Bodett, founder and director of the Center for Mad Culture, right here in downtown Chicago. We initially got to know each other over Zoom, but on April 4th, the Center for Mad Culture hosted an exhibition for a video game that one of their artists in residence created. It's called Copper Odyssey 2, Museum of Miracles. I helped write some image descriptions for some of the characters are actually on the wall right behind the camera, but working in that way was, again, a very different experience. It was less about helping and more about tending to different sorts of access needs. As I was creating this podcast series and I told Matt that I was creating this series, he told me about his very own series that he started, Mad Tea. Whereas someone you know mainly focuses on the larger concept of disability and disability studies, Mad Tea specifically dives into the history of madness and our ways of understanding and pathologizing the human mind. I don't want to say too much because I want to give him the opportunity to speak for himself, but needless to say, I'm very grateful and very lucky to have someone with so much experience, not only in the realm of disability and working with the disability community, but when it comes to podcasting, because God knows I can still use some help with all this. Without further ado, welcome, Matt.
Thank you. I'm really glad to do this.
Oh, thank you again. So just getting started, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your connection to disability and madness?
Yeah, like a lot of people who are experiencing madness, I was a college student actually when I had my first real kind of crisis. And I was early in undergrad, early 20s, and began experiencing things that I knew were not natural or like not things that were experienced by everybody. In mad studies, there's a term called consensus reality, and it's this idea that like we all consent that certain things are occurring at the same time. So these experiences were sort of outside of that consensus reality, that other people weren't experiencing them. I recognized that, and This would have been, I think, around 2005 when I was first given a diagnosis. I was living in Idaho at the time, so there weren't quite as many resources. There was definitely not much discussion happening about it. Mad studies never even crossed my mind. I picked up, I think after my diagnosis, I went and found a Barnes and Noble and looked for books that I could find about schizophrenia. And the only one I could find was Surviving Schizophrenia by E. Fuller Torrey. And I read that trying to figure out what was going on with me. And then, over a series of years, in and out of hospitals frequently, ended up eventually moving to Chicago. That decision was partly to pursue studio art practice more fully. Idaho didn't have a very robust system, so I wanted to get somewhere that had more opportunity. And coincidentally and unknowingly, I kind of landed into one of the disability hubs of the world, and very, very, very quickly ended up meeting Carrie Sandall and getting into a residency, actually the same residency that Cam, who is exhibiting here, the same residency program was my introduction to disability. Now, it hadn't been my introduction to madness because that was kind of on my own terms and like my own experiences. And when I got here, though, Carrie was the one that challenged me a little bit and pushed me to think about it in the disability world and its relationship to disability. So went through a series of things, was always making artwork about the experience, and then eventually found somebody speaking about mad studies and mad history. And it blew my mind because I didn't realize that was a thing, that there was really that much academic research as well as kind of culture building around madness. And so I ran with it. And then 3 years ago, chose to open the Center for Mad Culture as an opportunity to take the things that I have been able to learn and experience and kind of offer them to other people as well. That's a very Reader's Digest version.
And thank you for that explanation. Like when you mentioned that you accidentally came to one of the hubs for disability studies or disability, like understanding disability as a broader concept. A lot of people I feel like don't know Chicago has a pretty like decent history with the disability rights and justice movements. We had the very first disability pride parade take place in Chicago. And you mentioned Carrie Sandall, who was one of my capstone advisors. She currently works at UIC in the DHD program, and she's just a great source of knowledge when it comes to disability, forms of expression, and how we can use art to learn more about the disabled experience. So thank you for saying all of that about your time here in Chicago. Now you talk a lot about madness and think about madness as an identity or as a culture. First of all, just as a baseline, what is madness and how would you define mad culture?
Yeah, this is a really complicated subject. It's not like other identities that can be, for example, Black communities. It can be pretty obvious if you are part of that community or not. It does get complicated. I know that there's overlap that can be more nuanced there, but with madness, there's no distinct identifying marker that says like you are mad. So when we think about madness, I think we have to back away from the way that we typically experience language and identifiers, and we have to say that there's much more subtlety to it, and more often than not, it is going to be defined by the experiencer and their comfort level with their experiences. So one thing for sure is that it is kind of the antithetical model to mental health and mental illness. So it butts up against these diagnoses, and it says that the experiences in which I have are not defined by a diagnosis. So when I talk about madness, that tends to be where I'm coming from. Is I'm having experiences that might be these non-consensus experiences, but I don't think that they're medicalized problems. I don't see them as indicators that I am or need to be pathologized and fixed. So we're pretty radically kind of bumping up against mental health and mental illness, though we do include them in that discussion. We don't exclude the idea of, for some people, psychiatric medications can be beneficial, but we also need to understand it's not for everybody. So that's the kind of thing with madness is we have a very flexible sort of system around that language in order to allow kind of the individual experience to be authentic and remain true to them. The other caution is that the more we define madness, the more parameters we put around it, the more we become psychiatry, which is the very system we're trying to butt up against. So, as we try to define it, I'm very cautiously trying to give some sort of semblance of this is roughly what it is, but we also need to be okay not defining it and allowing all of us to come to it on our own terms a little, which ties into the idea of mad culture in a very interesting way, because if it's loosely defined, what is mad culture then? So really what this ends up coming down to is a loose knit version of all sorts of people who identify with madness. So that's the tying factor, is that the experiencers themselves are identifying with that terminology in identity. And then we're coming to it and saying that the experiences we have are actually culturally relevant as opposed to only medically relevant. And if they're culturally relevant, then this presumption of stigma, the reasons that we don't talk about madness, the reasons we don't talk, and we could even just replace that with mental health. The reasons we don't talk about mental health and madness is so often tied to the way that stigma permeates all of our society. And that stigma exists because mad people have been excluded from cultural production. They've been excluded from cultural ideation, from cultural discussions, critiques, all of this, because we've presumed for so long that they are non-rational. So they don't know what they're talking about. And so we exclude them. And that has come to the detriment of mad and disabled people who, at its worst, we get rounded up and killed, literally. In its kind of day to day, we're still very, very siloed. We're taken aside because we have to either mask and pretend like we fit in with everybody else, or if we don't, we run the risk of possibly being medicalized. And there's been a rash of killings recently, actually. Police responding to crises, and they're not trained, so they just show up and shoot. And that's the sad thing, is that the experiences are not talked about in a way that seems productive. So then the alternative is that they are scary. Yeah, so we very often have these responses to madness that say it is problematic as opposed to just different. And we can approach different, we can work with different. So that's kind of a rough, quick idea of what, at least where I'm coming from when I'm talking about mad culture.
That was a very good explanation. So just kind of to sum things up, it's mad culture is a way of seeing different psychiatric conditions, not through the lens of medicalized pathology, saying that this sort of mind or this sort of experience is wrong and needs to be fixed, but rather shifting it to a framework of this is a sort of difference. This is just a kind of diversity that humans experience. Instead of on the outside, it's on the inside, relating to our minds and what we experience like in the outside world.
Mm-hmm. And that ties so much. Our society is more and more honing itself down to assimilation. Everything needs to be the same.
Yeah.
Which means that as that happens more and more, as we shave off just a little bit of difference, we're going to have more and more diagnoses. We're going to have more ways that we see people as odd and different. And then those become pathologized, become like, oh, we need to fix you. You need to fit into this model. And it very often just has to come down to productivity. And does somebody fit into a society that values productivity over authenticity and human experience?
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned productivity. As a DHD student, I think the more I learn about disability, the more I learn about how we think about the concept of disability and what it means to be disabled relates to our ideas of capitalism and production.
Mhm.
How, as a society, we value people who are able to contribute or produce something, viable or useful for society. And that is the determiner of whether you're, fit mentally, physically, or if you're like a worthy member of society. And that
Mhm.
it can be very scary for people who don't fit into those norms to be like, well, what happens next if like I no longer am accepted or I'm no longer seen as someone worth being with or being around.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we talk about madness, one of the things on your website for the Center for Mad Culture says that you are dedicated to exploring madness as an identity. So, you talked a little bit about mad culture and how it's a little bit of a looser term. What would you say it means to study madness as an identity?
Um, of course, I'm speaking all from me.
Right.
What the way that I understand mad identity is an ability to embrace ambiguity, an ability to understand that the world may not function exactly as others say it is. For them, it might be working one way. For me, time is different. The experiences are very different. So my identity is kind of tied around difference. And it goes back to that kind of what we were just talking about, this sort of social idea of mental health or disability is it wouldn't be different if society had different values. It wouldn't be a difference. It would just be integrated into like our normal structures of maybe spirituality or maybe different types of, if we can envision worlds of productivity that weren't capitalist driven, that were like maybe co-optively driven or something. So for me, mad identity gets caught up in this uh, understanding of I know I'm going to experience the world differently, and I'm going to identify with that in order to understand it as a tool of my identity. It doesn't define who I am, but by working with it, I can actually embody it more fully. I can integrate it into something I'm proud of. I know that those differences are things that other people don't experience, so I can also use them kind of to my own advantage. How do I, you know, become a productive human being on my terms as opposed to theirs?
Right. So, from what you're talking about, mad identity seems very similar to the concept of disability culture, seeing disability and everything that comes with it as just another part of the natural variation and diversity of human beings, humankind, and also very similar to this concept that we talk about in my disability studies courses called disability justice. For those of you who aren't familiar, disability justice is a framework created in response to the original disability rights movement that started in the 70s, with critiques that those movements mainly focused on people who were already able to gain access to the legal systems, to power, to advocate for themselves, and kind of invisibilized women, people of color, and queer people with disabilities, including those with various psychiatric conditions or what we call, madness. So, disability justice encourages movement building by creating interdependence between members to create mutual aid networks to help each other out, not so much relying on outside organizations or outside governmental forces, kind of taking their own life and identity into their own hands. Now, one of the things that mad culture and disability justice overlap on is that they both seek to re-examine and recontextualize our ideas about disabled bodies and minds, seeing these as, just natural diversity, not something bad or wrong that has to be fixed and pathologized and studied. So there's this really great quote that I want to read from the Sins Invalid Disability Justice booklet called Skin, Tooth, and Bone. Quote, "There is no neutral body from which our bodies deviate. Society has written deep into each strand of tissue of every living person on earth. What it writes into the heart muscles of five-star generals is distinct from what it writes in the pancreatic tissue and intestinal tracts of black single mothers in Detroit, of Mexicana migrants in Fresno. But no body, that's two words, no space body, stands outside the consequences of injustice and inequality. What our bodies require in order to thrive is what the world requires. If there is a map to get there, it can be found in the atlas of our skin and bone and blood, in the tracks of neurotransmitters and antibodies." So I really like this quote, especially for that first line about there being no neutral body that ours deviate from, because the whole concept of disability or labeling someone as disabled relies on this idea that there is an ideal or neutral body that is considered able and, you know, like the standard, and that all other bodies that don't fit that mold, don't fit that norm, automatically kind of get thrown onto the disabled pile or are invisibilized or treated as something that needs to be pushed off into one part of society where we can't really be exposed to it. And that is kind of similar, or what you've been talking about when you're saying people with madness, people with different psychiatric conditions have been, not listened to, been thought of as crazy, and not really have their experience taken into account. There's another really great piece of wisdom from that same booklet, talking about the key components, the four main concepts of a disability justice framework. And I feel this also very much lines up with what Mad Studies and Mad Culture is trying to get at. So these four concepts are: one, all bodies are unique and essential; two, all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met; three, we are powerful not despite the complexity of our bodies, but because of them; and four, all bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them. And I feel like those same things can be said about madness, but changed body to mind. All minds are unique. All minds have strengths. We are powerful because of the complexities of our minds, and we are confined by the environments that we find ourselves in, both socially, physically, and mentally. Oh, especially when it comes to madness.
And there's, I mean, as you're talking about it and saying like we could swap out those words, uh, totally, we can absolutely swap out those words. But I think too, we need to also grow in our understanding that body and mind are not two different things, that they are not separate or interchangeable, that just they inhabit the same space and time and physicality. And so I think the unfortunate side to that thinking is that people are like, oh, like mental health is just like having a broken bone, you can just fix it and go to a doctor and get it fixed. I don't mean that body and mind are identical in how they act, but that they are not separate from each other. So I think what I have always appreciated about disability justice is their push for this sort of equality on all terms. And as I read it, I don't. Yeah, to your point, I don't read their justice mottos, their justice framework any differently than what a MAD framework is. So we're typically always pretty well in line.
Yeah, and that a lot of that is because as disability justice was evolving right after the initial disability rights movement, mad culture was also starting to gain more prominence and more of kind of its own feet as its own movement, instead of just a part of disability rights as a bigger whole. But to what you were talking about, body and mind being part of the same reality, I think, especially when it comes to issues of disability and madness, our bodies the way we experience the physical world condition our minds to think certain things or to make certain connections. And then with those connections, with those perceptions that we have of certain things, they condition our lived experience, how we move through the world and interact with the people around us, the places around us. It essentially creates its own feedback loop, kind of. The mind determines how we experience our reality, and our reality is shaped by mind in some way. So, coming back to the Center for Mad Culture, that's where we currently are right now in the historic Fine Arts Building of downtown Chicago. First of all, it's a wonderful historic building. It's been here for, gosh, a long, long time. Really great spot. It's close to all of the great arts and culture centers of Chicago. Now, speaking about the Center for Mad Culture, I just want to get a little bit of background. What led you to founding this center, and specifically why the Fine Arts Building?
Part of that was convenience. My partner and I have had a studio in the building. I think we're going on 8 years. And that was through a friend, somebody that we knew had invited us to come to a studio, open studio event. We came to the building and fell in love with the building in particular. So we got a studio here. And then, then we hit COVID, the COVID times, and everything's locked down. And then there was the murder of George Floyd. And, we participated in protests, but we were trying to also gauge how do we remain authentic to being good allies in this sort of struggle that Black folks are experiencing without taking over anything, because it's not our place to over speak what they're doing, but we also want to be really, really strong allies. So we were thinking a lot about, how do we do that? And it occurred to me that one way for me to authentically embody that was to more fully lean into mad culture, because ultimately mad culture and mad justice, disability justice, radical mad thinking, all of this is tied to, Palestinian liberation, Black liberation, indigenous rights, water rights, ecological disasters. Like all of this is tied up in madness. And so the more fully I can work with madness and mad culture, the more I realize I'm acting as a better ally also for those kind of interrelated justice models. And so, that was a conclusion from the protests that we had attended. And then the neighbor at our studio, the next studio over, was moving out. And so very quickly I hopped on that, grabbed the lease, and realized the Center for Mad Culture would be that space. And that's more or less how it came about.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great story. Lots going on there. But to your point about, how your dive into mad studies and mad culture has made you a better advocate, it goes back to what I was talking about, how bodies and minds are confined by ability, race, gender, sex, class. They're all interrelated, especially when it comes to the field of disability, because anybody of any age, race, nation can become disabled, can experience disability. And so we can't really just pigeonhole ourselves into this is our movement, this is the one thing that we focus on, and everybody else go do your own thing. Disability as a movement building framework, disability justice and disability rights, kind of necessitates an intersectional base, because everyone coming from all walks of life will experience that disability differently, especially when it comes to madness.
And I find even in that regard, one of the really beautiful aspects that I think disability justice, one model that it can provide for future ideations, for future ways that we're thinking, is that how disability justice is a great model that exists without borders. And so often a lot of our work is around nationalism We're kind of confined to national borders, state borders, things like that. So we silo off just a little bit, and we run into a lot of problems when we start. I mean, our current political system should be evident of that. When we overemphasize the power of a border. And I think disability justice has done a wonderful job of giving us models that exist without those constraints. How do we work together? How do we uh, cohabitate the entire world and create networks and valuable systems that can populate the entire globe?
Very nicely put. Now, this next question, in your own words, what would you say is the goal or like the main vision for the Center for Mad Culture? And has it changed since you have been working here, since you've established the center and gotten to work with people in the community?
I wouldn't say its goal has changed necessarily. One part of it is to create mad historical awareness. We want people to be aware that there's a history of madness, that it has cultural relevance, and those kinds of things. That is a long running goal. That job will probably never be done. But the other more subtle goal is to empower mad people and to get them into the space, to bring artists in and let them have free reign of the exhibition space and just say, this is yours. What story do you want to tell about your experiences? It doesn't have to be about madness, because mad people can also make artwork about anything. So it's this idea that mad people have tons of potential, and we're not limited to very specific things. But in this context, we're empowered by the sort of strategic history of activists in the past, but also as we're sitting here next to this library shelf, we're also supported by a really robust amount of research and the power of word as it comes to us through book form. So we want mad folks to feel empowered by community that they maybe didn't realize existed at this level.
Oh, that's very beautifully put. And you speaking about artists and how they can use their art to express themselves either with madness or not, that I think is a perfect segue to my next question. What role does art and artistic expression play in what you do here at the Center for Mad Culture? Because when I was first assigned to this site to work for my degree requirements, I was told this is mainly a disability arts collective that works with different people with various conditions to help them fine tune their craft and work on their art skills. So, how does art and artistic expression fit into all this?
I'll talk about it from my personal experience, because my background is visual art. That's how I came to the space as well. I was thinking one concern that I have continually had in through my own experiences and knowing other mad folks is that as we talk about madness in sort of art circles, it's either highly romanticized, like somehow it's associated to being a genius, or it is sort of hushed away. We don't want, like, don't talk about your feelings, don't talk about how like weird you feel or what's going on. We don't want to, can't bring that up in an art critique all the time. Some people just aren't comfortable or have the vocabulary to talk about it. So there's all sorts of range of problems there. So for me, opening the space came from that art making, in where I did not feel like I was allowed the authenticity of my own voice. And that, I think, is the power of art, is that it is absolutely about an individualized voice. And why couldn't and shouldn't we be able to dive in on these sort of experiences that call out mental health or systems that are a bit more problematic in the world? We do it in other ways, so why not? And for me, art is actually very well suited for madness, because madness is on its own kind of an abstract experience. It doesn't, it's not defined, as we've already talked a little bit, it's not defined by many of the standards of the standard world, the consensus reality, but neither is art. Art's already an abstract language. We've taken things, we've just created a bunch of like purple smears on a canvas, and that's supposed to represent something. And so if we're able to talk about things artistically, I think it gives us an avenue to talk about things madly. They're not too dissimilar from their ambiguities, their abilities to move away from standard vocabularies.
Very good. Going back to that point on authenticity, I think it's again very true what you're saying about art being some of the most authentic form of expression, whether that's music, visual painting, digital art, even making the video game that I was helping with, or at least helping with the reception for when you did that exhibition. But it's why it's important to be authentic with art, because I feel like there are a lot of movements in our society to kind of sanitize our forms of expression to make them more easily consumable for, the general public. And as a result, it's kind of making art lose its edge. It's not so much about what is the authentic experience that you want to express about yourself. It is more about how can I make a thing that appeals to the most number of people so that I can get recognized. It has fallen victim to that capitalist production mindset.
And the Center for Mad Culture, while we are a gallery space in name, we are not a commercial space. We're not a market driven model. We don't sell the artwork. I mean, the work is for sale. If somebody really did want to buy something, that could be arranged, but we are not, we host all of our exhibitions assuming nothing's for sale. Like, we're just interested in the conversation. We're interested in what does the artist need? What does the artist want to say? How are they going to experiment with the space? What are they going to try out? That is our first, kind of our foremost priority within the exhibitions themselves. But then for me, it's valuable because it gets rid of the capital. It gets rid of that desire that some people have to play to the market. We're not interested in that.
Right. Yeah, that was, again, another very well put phrase. My next question was about some of the exhibits, talking about some of the previous exhibits that you've put on and how they relate to disability justice and mad cultural awareness. I feel like we kind of covered some of that. But is there anything else you want to say on that point about how these exhibitions here that you put on kind of connect to the broader themes of mad cultural awareness?
I mean, we've had a huge range of things. The first exhibition we held was J.J. McLucky, who did, there was a series of paintings on the wall, but then also painted a mural on one of the walls. And that exhibition was specifically talking about queer madness and that overlap, which is really complex. And I think even more highlighted now in our contemporary politics. We're seeing more and more how queer and trans folks are victims of abuses from a system that sees them really not as human, and how they turn that into a pathologization. And so that overlap with madness is very distinct in this moment. So those are the kinds of conversations we've had there. We've had our exhibition just before this one was Melissa Kreider, who did a series of photographs that were women who had been imprisoned for accidentally killing their abusers in self-defense. And so there's this really complex relationship around who gets seen as crazy or not within scenarios where it's life or death. And suddenly these women who end up in kind of ingested into an incarceral system and seen as mad because of an act of self-defense, because the world around them basically chose not to protect them from their abusers in many ways. So like they're very nuanced and difficult conversations, but well, that's the kind of stuff I think we're really aiming at, some of that. Now, of course, Cam Collins, who's got the current exhibition with the video game, it doesn't maybe hit quite so heavy. It's not photographs of women being locked up, right? Like that's a heavy topic. Cam's is still a heavy topic, but it is done so playfully, and it's a video game, and you enter into this this experience of madness as world building, madness that can be generative and move into ways that we can then embody other characters, and these other characters exist in a world that has different rules than ours. And how do those rules also respond to perhaps the artist's own madness and their experience of the world? So we get to embody somebody else's madness almost in this regard. So it's still a heavy topic, but in a completely different kind of way, and it comes across more playful. The colors are more playful, right? So I love it because it also it shows that there's not a right or wrong way to talk about madness. That there's a plethora, there's a massive amount of ways of approaching this information and the kind of individual experience, and none of it's necessarily right or wrong. So like, how are we just going to keep having these conversations?
Right? It's not that any of these ways of viewing or seeing or perceiving madness are right, wrong. They're just different ways, different methods of understanding and viewing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It is how, we see a thing and then connect it to meaning in our society. But when it comes to madness, I feel like it is the perception of what a mad person is and what they are capable of that makes it so stigmatized or feared. It is more so like if you call someone mad so many times, then eventually you're going to be like wary about them, and maybe even they might start having some self perceptions about their own sanity. And it is, again, a feedback loop of we treat madness like it's something to be, scared of, or something that we shouldn't deal with, or something to be, avoided, instead of just embracing what comes with madness, what comes with having a mind that deviates from others, and how, like you said, it can be generative in the case of Cam's video game. Some of the amazing characters that he came up with, that I had to describe, I had to write visual descriptions for each of them in as neutral terms as possible. And doing that, just looking at some of the characters that he created and trying to find explanations for them, was an experience in and of itself of just deconstructing what I thought I knew about what it meant to be like a character, and just describing what I see and how it appears to me. So it is, I feel like mental illness, madness, psychiatric conditions are so much wrapped up in societal perceptions of how we see those things, how we ascribe value and meaning, and moralize sometimes some of these conditions and some of these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we're starting to wrap up a little bit, is there anything that you want to say to those people in the audience who may have experienced madness, or know someone who has experienced some sort of psychiatric breakdown or condition, or any advice you would want to give to future MAD advocates?
I mean, there's a lot.
Yeah. Fair.
For people who are perhaps caring for somebody, my go-to advice is to always believe them. Don't treat the things that they express and say as if they're false. Don't try to talk them out of the things that they're experiencing. Don't tell them, that's not real. Come back to reality, because the things that they're experiencing are real. Just because it's not a consensus reality, I could be using that word, but just because it doesn't fit into our consensus reality doesn't mean it's not real to them. So I think that it is always about, validate them as a human in their experiences. That doesn't mean you have to validate their what's perceived as a delusion. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to say, I hear those too. I hear those voices. You just, that sounds troubling. I'm not hearing them, so I can't understand, but I believe you, right? Those kinds of things are really important. And then for those of who may be experiencing madness themselves, the advice I perhaps would have given to my younger self is to don't feel alone. Just know that there genuinely is a massive community of people who care about your rights, your medical rights, your human rights, your creative rights, your ability to just exist within your own madness, but also to be responsible with it, to understand that it comes with different types of awareness, that you have to be, around people productively at some level. So find those communities, find people, even if it has to be online right now, but if you're in Chicago, of course, come to the Center for Mad Culture. Find the people who are doing that kind of work, because they do exist all over the place. There's things like the Hearing Voices Network. All of these exist with massive networks. So it's a little easier now with the internet to find them. So my suggestion is always just connect and keep connecting.
Right, and that actually segues perfectly into my last question. How can the folks at home learn more about the Center for Mad Culture or get into contact with yourself or somebody else who works here if they're interested in visiting and seeing what this place is all about?
There's a lot of ways. The place we are most active is Instagram. That's the easiest to kind of give quick updates. So you can find us on Instagram, Center for Mad Culture. Our website is madculture.org. And our podcast, again, is Mad Tea. Tea as in the drink, TEA.
Yes, TEA.
There's the funny play on words there, right? With like, let me tell you the tea.
Yes.
So yeah, not to be confused, but the Mad Tea is our podcast. So, well, with the podcast, we try to give like historical perspectives and information, as well as some like cultural ideas. So that's one way to connect. And then, of course, you can always email us through our website.
All right, thank you for that. I just want to again give an endorsement of Mad Tea. I listened to the first episode. It was phenomenal. It was a great little basis for madness, introducing people to mad culture, and just some other things that you'll be discussing in some future episodes that you have. So if you haven't listened to Mad Tea yet, it is available on Spotify. And also if you go to the Center for Mad Culture website for Chicago, it should be under one of those little submenus.
Yeah, we got a tab there.
Yes. If you want to learn more about madness as a cultural identity and the Center of Mad Culture in downtown Chicago, visit their websites, which will be linked in the description. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Someone You Know. By listening here today, you've taken a step to better understand disability as a larger concept and how we subject abnormal bodies and minds to arbitrary labels. If something you heard today sparked your interest or made you curious, leave a comment or tell a friend about this episode. And remember, even if you personally don't see disability in your everyday life, chances are that someone you know loves someone with a disability. And now you know more. We'll see you guys next time.